Um, so I'll start with a little poem from Emily Dickinson. It's the way I read letter. This is a well-known poem. And it sounds a little bit hokey, but what I really wanted you to think about is I want you to be thoughtful about how it is you're going to read papers, right? You're going to be reading papers throughout your career. This is not like you just say, well, I'm just going to sit down and read a paper. No, and that might be the way you want to do it, but I recommend you actually have a methodical process. If you're going to start reading or going through hundreds of papers and then whittling down that process, you want to make sure you have a pretty good process to find what it is you really should be spending your time on. So you want to find what is your little secret process for you to do your letters. So why do we read? Well, the most important thing in my view for reading is it's really about how you do research, right? If I had to say one thing that I use as a predictor for how well will a particular PhD student do in our program, in my lab, how much they read is the number one predictor. The more they read, the more productive they are as a PhD student, which is sometimes hard. They're like, I don't have time to read. It's like, no, you've got to keep reading. That's what's going to give you new ideas. It's going to help you understand how to write better. So as you do this research, it's going to help you learn to critically think about the quality of research in papers. So part of what we will want to get out of the process, although not today's part of the process, we'll eventually get to how do I critically understand how papers are? Because the more you understand how people critically read papers, the more you will understand how reviewers will read your papers. Because that's what you really have to prepare for. You have to have your papers ready for them. So you want to think about all the things reviewers might ask and then prepare for that. Someone's going to be thinking about your work. And you also want to understand the difference between what's hot and what's a fad and what's lasting research. That's a little harder. We really won't get too deep into that. But understanding how to critically read will be part of what we talk about today. Another reason to read is to gain perspective. I will read papers outside of my discipline to put my discipline in context. And understanding how people write is another part of the perspective, right? If a paper's got 5,000 citations, I might read it just to figure out what made this paper so important, even though I will never build on it, right? How they wrote it, what did they do, right? Looking at your perspective from an author's point of view can be very important. And as you read papers, the really key issue is what are the questions to ask and answer in your research field. So the more you read papers, the more you get to understand what were or are key research questions. How does the paper answer them? So you can become better at that process of identifying that's an important problem, that's not. That's how you write about the problem so that people get it, and here's how you answer those questions. Because if you can't do that, now so as you read more and more papers, your skills at writing will be getting better, which is really part of what our goal is. But even if you don't write many papers, understanding how to read them is still important. So they're the primary way in which research is disseminated. They really come in two major, or maybe three categories. Conference papers, journal papers. The conference papers tend to be a little bit shorter, 6 to 8, depending on the conference you look at. Journal papers, longer, 12, whatever. Journal papers in computer science are often a more complete version of a conference paper with more experimentation, more elaboration. Sometimes it's actually that because they might take a year or two to come out, they might also combine multiple conference papers, like two or three results, combine them together. And there are papers, however, in computer science that don't ever show up in a conference. They're straight to journals. And one of the reasons you do that, and I've done it multiple times in my own lab, is because if a conference only allows me 8 pages, actually, to be honest, I will try the best conference. If I can't explain it well enough in 8 pages, then I have no choice, right? I can't fit it in, so I need 12 pages to explain it well, then I go to a journal and just start there. And then there's one other category of papers which are neither of these. And you will see lots and lots of these, more and more common, are things that are effectively technical reports, or things that are not really published. And the most common thing you will find for those, although they're like MIT technical reports and CMU has their own technical report library, Archive, A-R-X-I-V, is the dominant tech report library in the country, or the world. It's got thousands of papers, hundreds of papers come out a day, to a point that there are actually now programs called like Archive Sanity Preserver, which you can use to help filter it because there's just too much stuff coming out. But Archive is a place where you do want to keep up, but you also want to remember that things up there have not gone through any review process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Peer review is the cornerstone of our process. How do people make sure what's in a paper is right? Well, we hopefully get good reviewers that will give the author's feedback, but will also check it. So when I do conference reviewing, I would say a quarter of the papers have serious technical flaws. They are simply wrong, right? Now, some of those papers will show up in archives, right? If you find an archive paper that is more than 3 years old and is not from a super famous artist who's sort of much said, I don't care anymore, I'm not going to bother, right? So Hinton will do this, Bengio's got a couple of, right, where they don't care. Because after 3 years, like if a paper has a couple thousand citations, give it some credence. But if it's been in archive for 4 years and it has like 2 citations or 5 citations other than the author, something's probably seriously wrong with it, right? Now, that can be a good exercise. Go through it and figure out what is wrong with it. It can be a learning exercise, but be careful about citing really old papers that have shown up in a non-peer review archive, because I can go in there and I can just make up stuff, right? I can say, I have proven P equals NP. I can write down a bunch of formulas. No one ever cites it because my proof is wrong. Well, maybe there's something issue. So there is this other category. It's actually very useful in your career. It's something to discuss, however, with your advisor. Before you push your paper onto archive, you want to have that conversation with your advisor. Sometimes it is politically and academically expedient to put it on archive to sort of stake out the territory. This is ours, we have these results. I've had papers where me and somebody else in the field pretty much came up with the same idea at the same time. They got to publish it first, right? Archive makes it so I can put it out there and I've got it there as it's published, right? Somebody else might still publish it in a bigger venue, get more prestige, but at least our stuff is out there. The disadvantage is lots of conferences in computer science are double blind. So you want to check to make sure that the conference doesn't consider the fact that you put it on an archive as already being out there. Most CS conferences don't, but there are a few still that say, no, once it's on archive, it's no longer new to us, so we're not going to accept it. You have to understand what that is. So I'm going to recommend a 5-pass process for reading research paper, which is actually some same path process that Kirchhoff recommends, I think from either Illinois or CMU, I forget, but I've been doing this for a long time. So this 5-pass method is the path we'll talk about in this class, right? It's a pretty good process. You might actually have another pass or two here and there, and you might combine them, but I really like to recommend them this way, and we'll talk about them today. And your next reading assignment, or your next homework assignment, we'll be going through it. So in last class, or for the last assignment, you have to go find 25 papers, right? I assume all of you did keyword searches in Google, because that's what we talked about last time, right? So what's wrong with keyword searches? Why isn't that enough? We've already talked about that. Well, I think it's really important to keep aware of the field. And as I mentioned last time, you often don't even know what you don't know. You don't know what terms are being described. Other people might have something that, until Google tells you it's related work, you might not know it. And that might be late for you. But even if it's related, maybe there's other reasons you want to keep, because you don't even know that this technique could be used. Google may not know that it could be used to solve your problem. So if you have a problem reading papers in your field, it is an important way of keeping up. And it can lead to new research ideas you've never had and new research directions. You read this paper, it's like, oh wow, that's interesting. That's actually related to this, and now I could do that, right? That's the other reason to read, is to find new research directions. If you try and compete with your advisor for ideas in the area your advisor reads and you don't, you will lose every time, okay? If you read papers your advisor doesn't, you might actually come to them with ideas they have not already thought of, right? And that might actually be good for you to sort of both gain confidence with your advisor, but it's also just, and eventually that's how you're going to keep up, right? You can't just follow people, you have to lead. So you want to do that. So, but if you're going to consider the hundreds of papers in a big conference, right? 600 or 700 papers a year, and journals have 1,000 to 6,000, or sorry, 100 to 600 papers, right? There's 1,000 to 2,000 papers in your field a year, okay? How are you going to keep up? You can't try and read in the traditional way people think of reading the papers, all the papers. And for those of you for whom English is not your first language, right, this is going to seem like a very daunting project. But in fact, if English is not your first language, it's more important you develop a good process, because if your reading rate is slower, if you can't actually read an entire paper in an hour, right, but it takes you 4 hours, then you've got to find a way to not read the papers you shouldn't read. And that's a big part of what our process is about how do I whittle this down to make a reading list that you add to frequently, but is not ridiculous. So the first of these is what we're going to call the browse. If you have to go through hundreds or thousands of papers a year, the browse is their first stage to be efficient. This is super fast triage. Part of what I'm going to ask you to do for your assignment, but also what I think is important, is you want to browse through lots of papers, not just the ones you instantly think are interesting. So you're going to look at read the abstract, scan the figures and captions. And this is a 1 to 2 minute gut check. Is this paper worth my time to go to the next stage? We're going to go, our filter is going to go to the next stage, until I actually spend an hour on the paper. The first 3 stages, if you've done it right, you spent less than 10 minutes on a paper, that's gone through the first 3 stages.
Do you set up an agent to do this, or do you like?
The agent is me.
Okay.
So in fact, what I recommend and what your assignment will be is browsing is a technique I use, right, by going through a conference proceedings or the issue of it when a new issue of a journal comes out. So I have for all of IEEE journals, you can have them push you a table of contents. They will email you every month. Here is the table of contents, right, and then I can literally just click on them and open them up and look through them. Major conferences, right? We publish proceedings. I will sit down with the proceedings of a conference and I will browse through it. Now, to be honest, the conferences are so big, I don't do complete browsing anymore because it's impossible. I just don't have that much time. But I will take conferences, and most journals have subsections. So if your conference has, here are all the things related to deep learning. That might be a third of my conference. Here's the things related to stereo vision. Here's 20 papers. Here's the things related to, so I go through them by topic, and then I will browse every paper on that topic. And oddly enough, I now normally do this for conferences before I get to the conference. Because almost every conference we have that I take part in, we publish the lists of our papers and the proceedings of the papers 2 weeks ahead of time, at least a week ahead of time, so that people have a chance to look at them. This way, because now I want to maximize my time at the conference. So I will have read, or at least browsed, scanned, and in light reading, the papers that are most interesting to me, so I can go find those authors and talk to them while they're there, as opposed to hoping to read the papers after the conference and figure out what they were. So if I have any questions, I want to be able to go up to their poster and talk to them then. So, and that's what the other reason I'll do the browse is to figure out how to optimize my time at the conference. So there are some things for browsing, like a venue check. There are whole venues that I just ignore. I don't care, right? It doesn't matter what's published in there. I will not browse them, right? It doesn't mean I won't read papers from there, but I've only found those papers because people cited them or from a search or whatever, right? I just don't go read conferences whose venue quality is low. As I mentioned last time, there are certain authors, right? In fact, if Hinton publishes it someplace, I might read it no matter where he published it because he's done so many good papers. Maybe there's something to that. Venue check can be very bad. One of my top 3 cited papers is in a horrible venue, but it's got lots of citations. It's got like 380 citations or whatever, right? Lots of people care about the paper. It just showed up in a really bad venue. Sometimes good papers show up in bad places. So that's a different reason to look at it. So that's the citation check. If the paper's got enough citations, I don't care where it showed up. I'll go read it because somebody must care. So papers and places or by people or stuff that you cite already know are relevant are more likely to be relevant. And this is the other reason, even though I listed this here, I don't browse these because these are ones that have sort of already made it through the browse list. Right? If they showed up in certain authors, right, that I follow, well then you'll get them. So you can see where that, oops, that is not what I wanted to do. So at this stage, I recommend you err on the side of being positive. You want to add it to the read list, even if it's only slightly positive chance that it'll be worthwhile for you because you haven't spent much time on it. So you want to make sure you get through that process. So you want to view browsing to be efficient as a sort of block activity. Okay, I don't recommend a depth-first search. You want to say, I'm going to browse through these 50 papers or 100 papers, and you want to browse every one of them before you spend any significant time on any paper. It is really easy to get sucked in and say, I'm going to read this one right now. But you want to allocate your time. This is my browsing time, then I'll do my reading time later. Once you add it to the reading list, you can come back to it later. And the reason for this is because the whole point of the browse is to cover a lot of material quickly. Every time you slow down by going off and reading a full paper, you may never come back and browse the rest of them, and you may miss something important. So you want to allocate a certain amount of your time and say, this is my process. I will spend half an hour or an hour browsing a week, or at least for a while, and keep up. And it can be hard to resist that temptation. And one of the things you will do in this next assignment is I want you to literally time yourself. Now, after you've done this for long enough, you'll get the timing down, and you don't need to time yourself. It's a waste of time to time yourself, except that this is an exercise. You're trying to get better at it, so you do want to actively time yourself. I recommend, because if you're doing this in the beginning, you might say, I'll just like take a note or two. I guarantee after you've read 50 papers, they're all muddled in your head. So my recommendation is you actually add them to a formal list with a priority score, and you can prioritize after browsing. Because in fact, you don't know that the next one might be even more important. So don't spend any time sorting or anything while you're doing your browse. Just put them on a list, put a number next to them, you can sort them later. Okay, so one of the important things about browsing is to also make sure you're choosing good venues. We will talk about venue selection and how to choose good places later. But the browsing part of this is important. Any questions on browsing? Okay. Normally when I browse, I take 0 notes. Right? Browsing is, it goes onto my reading list or not. If I take any other notes, it would be putting a score on it, right, so that I can sort them. And I don't even always bother with that. Depends on how many papers I'm browsing. So when I do a journal, because journals come out, there's like 15 papers, right? I just browse every one of them, and I don't bother with it. When I'm doing the conference proceedings, I actually do take, I have an electronic Emacs file where I put my notes in, and I do put notes in them. Also because I want to know, I have to prioritize not just what papers to read, but what papers to read before the conference, what papers will be what day at the conference. So literally my priority is like, I have this one done by Tuesday, but that one's not until Thursday, so I have another day or two to read, catch up. Okay, so browsing is pretty straightforward, but it's an important activity, and it's the only way to get through lots and lots of papers. The other problem I've seen with many students, the other reason I'm going to ask you to time yourself is lots of people become too quickly dismissive. As I said, you want to err on the side of being positive. People look at it and they like read the title of the abstract and they say this is completely irrelevant. They spent like 40 seconds on it or 30 seconds on it and they're done. Okay, I recommend you go just a little bit deeper because you might be surprised, despite the fact that the abstract is supposed to summarize what's in it. You might see something when you scan through the figures and the captions and the conclusions that actually catches your interest. It's worth spending. So my recommendation is you spend at least a minute, but not more than 3. Right? Because if you're not spending at least a minute, you're not giving the paper much of a chance. And it's surprising sometimes, there are people who like to have really clever titles, right? And there are people that like to write in a style which is, I want to surprise you at the end, right? So the abstract does not give away all the answers. They want to save a surprise for the conclusion. Now, I don't actually understand those people, but I see them all the time. So you can't just say the abstract doesn't show me what I need to know. Scan through it and see what'll go on. Okay, so after you've done the browse, stage 2 is the skim. So this is how I go through my reading list.
So are you saying we can like under promise in the abstract?
Can you? Yes. I would recommend you don't. But there are styles in which certain people like to under promise in the abstract.
What about over promise?
I never recommend you over promise. Under promise, over deliver, there's some value to that. One of the reasons people sometimes under promise in the abstract is because abstracts are sometimes literally committed 2 months before the final paper is done. And now you don't want to over promise, so you under promise in the abstract. And now if that venue doesn't let you change the abstract, you're stuck with it. The paper comes out, now that your paper actually gets much farther than the abstract said you were, but you don't. So I would take a conservative approach. Now, many conferences allow you, I mean, most CS conferences today, if you do that abstract, you will be able to change it. But some of them, because they print out nice fancy booklets and whatever, they have a pre-press requirement, right, that's much earlier. In fact, there are conferences in CS where your final paper is due at the conference. Literally, you show up and you say, here's my paper, right? Some of them will let you have your final paper is due 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, so you can get feedback at the conference and fix it, right? So you might have a preliminary version, have the conference, and then publish the paper 2 or 3 weeks later, so that it's up to date. So there's a whole range of things in CS, so you have to be very careful where they are. Although some of that you can know what the conference is. But others just stylistic. There are people, in my PhD, I was trained by 2 very different people, or 3 different people, but 2 of them were very different. One was, tell me everything up front, so if I read the abstract, I know everything. The other is, no, we're science. We don't actually draw a conclusion to the abstract. The abstract says, what's the paper about? Not what is the conclusion. The conclusion is what the conclusion section is for, right? And that's the way he was taught to write. That's the way he tried to teach me to write. I eventually rebelled. My conclusion shows up in the abstract. But we'll come back to style of writing later. So now the skim. So the skim is, now I'm actually going to sort of go through the paper and spend a little bit more time. So skims to me are between 5 and 10 minutes per paper. And the goal is to figure out, in this thing, you're going to assume everything the author says is true. There is no questioning the author. There is no, this is right or wrong. This is, Whatever the author says is right. You want to go through this, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide, a couple of things, right? But you really come up with a couple of sentences, and at this point I would be taking notes. What's the paper addressed? What's new about the solution? How significant is experimentation theory? And why is it relevant to me, to you, that you skimmed too lightly, right? So if you can't answer these questions, then you definitely skimmed too lightly. You should be able to answer all 4 of these questions. Honestly, I have 6 on the next slide, but and if you have too many ideas to express in 5 or 6 or 4 to 6 sentences, you may have gone too deep. And part of this is the practice level is to practice what's the right amount of time. Do I spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes? That depends a lot on how fast you read, right? I can skim a paper in 2 minutes that my students might spend 10 on because I have a lot more context, right? You got to figure out where you're at, but you don't. If you end up with taking too many notes, then you've gone too deep. If you don't have enough notes or enough, can't answer these questions, right? So the top 6 questions that I think you should be able to answer, which I'll call the 6 C's, are the category. What type of paper is this? Is this a theoretical paper? Is it an experimental paper? Is it something that other people will build on? Is it about a data set? You should have a high category, which is really easy to figure out. What's the context? What other papers in the field is it related to? And how is it related to your work? If you can't answer how it's related to your work, you definitely skimmed too shallow because you didn't get how is it going to relate to you. What are its main contributions? So this is, in fact, we often have to have, like, here are the main contributions of the paper. When we talk about writing, my recommendation is you'll make this really simple. There'll be a section that says, our main contributions are. You leave no doubt in their mind. But some papers make that a little harder. You have to dig for it. Is it credible? So this is, I said you trust the author. You can still be trying to decide, well, how credible is what they said, right? If their experiments are junk, then you're going to believe them, but you're also going to say, who cares, right? Their experiments were too shallow to show me anything. Who cares? This is actually probably the most important part of the scan test, is like the who cares test. Assuming everything is true, will anyone care? Will it change anything? Why do you care? If you don't care, even if this paper could be fundamental and change computer science, if you don't care, maybe that's it. That's it. You're done with this paper. Because your goal after the scan is to answer one of the important questions, which was not on my previous slides, but how much time and effort will it cost you to read this carefully? Right? And part of the who cares is, if it's going to take me 8 hours to really understand this paper, and it's not worth much, then why am I going to invest 8 hours? On the other hand, if it's going to take me an hour, and I think I could build on this, then I'm going to do it, right? That's a time management question you're going to have to go through. So you have to figure these two are not about the paper, they're about your handling of the paper. Do I care? Who else cares? And how much is it going to cost me to do this? So the paper's full with lots of math that you've never seen before, then you know you're going to spend hours trying to dig through that, right? On the other hand, if it's, I've seen every one of these equations before, that's why I can read so much faster than my students, right? I look at the equation, I know exactly what that is, I don't spend any time thinking about it. Then you might say, fine, it's going to be worth it. So we're now actually going to do a quick in-class exercise, so get a little bit more interactive. So you now have over.
Are they all unique, or are they?
There are 3, so in your pile there are 3 papers. Okay, I would like you to browse these 3 papers. Assume somehow they made it through your scan, or your advisor said, here, please go through these. I would like you to browse these 3 papers, and then we're going to discuss them very quickly.